Hello and welcome to AmericanNavalHistory.com. My name is John Sorensen, and this is a series of lessons that is designed to teach the history of the United States Navy and its role in American and world history in general. In this lesson, I want to pick up right where I left off before. Following the battles of Lexington and Concord, the British Army retreated into the city of Boston and were surrounded by colonial militiamen. After the British received reinforcements, they took Bunker Hill, which overlooked the city. The British were surrounded by land, but received some replenishment by sea. In this lesson, I want to pick up right there where the colonial leadership began considering the thought of actually building a navy. So now at this point, during the early summer of 1775, the British were trapped in the city of Boston, and they were surrounded by angry colonists who controlled the rest of the New England countryside. That is pretty much going to set the pattern for the rest of the war. The British will be able to take and control the cities, but never had nearly enough men to control the spread out countryside where most of the people actually lived. And this theme pretty much remained true throughout the rest of the war. And it frustrated the colonists to see the British ships come and go and to resupply the troops in Boston, and there was nothing that they could do about it. Now the British resupply ships were coming to Boston, where they were bringing guns and ammunition and other goods, but it was a 3 or 4, maybe even a 5-week journey from Great Britain. So most of the food that they brought over was stale, and the meat was heavily salted for preservation. Remember, they did not have any refrigerated cargo ships in 1775, so the British troops in Boston were not eating very well. So the colonists surrounding the city had great food, but they had a few guns and very little ammunition and gunpowder. But the British inside the city had plenty of guns, ammunition, and gunpowder, but they had very little food or firewood inside the city. Although the seaport seemed to be the only source of food for the British in Boston, there were 5 different methods of getting food to that seaport. One was the long transatlantic crossing from Great Britain. Food from Great Britain had to travel 3 to 5 weeks to arrive in Boston. Most of it arrived stale. The meat had to be heavily salted in order to be preserved for the long journey, and the shipment from Great Britain could not provide the large supply that was needed to feed 6,000 soldiers and all the loyalist Tories that were in the city, and they all had to eat every day. So, getting the ships in from Great Britain, that would have been a whole lot of shipping to get that much food from that one source. Another source they had was the sheep and the cattle that were grazing on the islands in Boston Harbor. Before the war, these islands right off the coast of Boston, were used by the colonialist farmers to raise cattle and sheep. And it was good grazing land, there was good grass there, lots of hay being raised there. But as soon as the war broke out, the colonists went out there and they gathered the sheep and the cattle in and brought them off that island. They wanted to get them out of the reach of the British Army. The third source was the transit from the British colonies in the Bahamas. Some ships went down to the Bahamas, mostly to New Providence. It was a much shorter and faster grocery run for them to make. The fourth would be captured American ships that were exporting food. Now the colonial merchants were still exporting food, and the farmers were sending their products to Europe and to the West Indies, but they were not being protected by a navy at sea. So the merchants were there were easy pickings for the armed ships of the British Navy. And the last one was a deceptive shipping manifest from the other colonies. there's at least one case where George Washington found out that there's a ship that left New York full of food and supplies, and the captain of the ship told the colonial port authorities that they were heading down to the West Indies, and he actually brought the ship up to Boston to give it to the British Army, and it was just a lie. But the New York authorities let them take the shipment and go, because they basically told them that they were going to the West Indies, and they didn't. But all of these sources summed up together, all 5 of these sources summed up together, were not sufficient to feed 6,000 soldiers and all the loyalists and the Tories that were cooped up under siege in Boston. Now, the need to intercept British shipping supplies was obvious to George Washington and the Continental Congress. This would deprive the British of their supplies, and it would also provide valuable supplies that the colonial army needed. I think George Washington calculated that he had enough gunpowder on hand for each soldier to fire 9 shots, and that was it. I mean, they had, I think it was 36 barrels of gunpowder, and they desperately need gunpowder, and the only place to get it was from the British. Everything that the colonists could take away from the British was something that they could use to fight against the British with. So, and gunpowder was probably the top of their shopping list. Having a navy to attack British supply ships would cause the British to use their warships in defense of their supply lines. Each ship that they had to use to guard their supply lines was one less ship that they would have available to raid American coastal towns or other duties worldwide that that their navy was committed to perform. So basically, if you could make the enemy use the assets that he has in ways other than he wants to use them, and that's right out of Sun Tzu. You look it up. It's in chapter 6. But and that's what George Washington had to do, was he wanted to force the British. See, the merchant ships, the supply ships, were unarmed vessels, and they were sailing the seas at will without being harassed or without being bothered. So if you could cause the British to take their armed ships, their navy ships, and make them guard the unarmed civilian ships, that's one less ship that's gonna harass the American coastline. By August 1775, George Washington decided to outfit civilian ships with guns and send them out to capture British supply vessels at sea. He was uncertain as to whether he had the actual authority from Congress to actually hire ships for commerce raiding, and he never really mentioned it in any of his letters to them. He wasn't sure if he was allowed to do what he was doing, but he needed to do it, so he just thought about going ahead and doing it. There was a colonel named John Glover. He was the leader of the militia group from Marblehead, Massachusetts. Now, Marblehead was a seaside village, and all of his men were experienced fishermen and seamen. Now, Glover also was a ship owner, and he was willing to rent one of his schooners, the Hannah, to the army. Washington agreed to rent the Hannah, and they brought it to Beverly, Massachusetts, and refitted it with 4-inch guns and a few swivel guns, which were little 1-inch cannons that you could adjust the angle of the fire of those. So make them lightly armed, little fast schooners that would go out to get unarmed British supply ships. When they did go out to sea under the command of Nick Broughton on September 7th, 1775, Washington ordered them to hunt for and to capture unarmed British supply vessels and to avoid contact with British warships, ships that can fight back. He said, don't go messing with ships that are going to shoot back at you. On the first day they were out, they they came across a British Navy vessel, the HMS Lively. Now, the Lively chased the Hannah, and the Hannah turned around when they found out who they were. There was an armed British ship, so they turned around, and the Lively chased the Hannah back into port at Cape Ann. The next morning, the Hannah went back out to sea and captured an unarmed ship called the Unity. And the Unity was carrying lumber to the British Army in Boston. And the Hannah captured the Unity and brought it into Gloucester, Massachusetts. Okay, so now this is where things start getting a little bit complicated. Let me try to give you a real brief summary of how this all worked out. The Hannah captured the ship that was providing supplies to the British. The officers and the crew were entitled to collect prize money for the ship and the cargo that they captured. The prize money would be division, the way that it would be divided up was all spelled out in great detail. How much the officers got and how much the enlisted men got, how much the non-commissioned officers would get, was all spelled out in writing very much before the Hannah went to sea. But as it turns out, the Unity was actually an American ship that was carrying its load of lumber down to the West Indies, and it was captured by the Lively. And the crew members of the Lively were carrying the lumber to Boston when the Hannah captured it. So technically, this was a recaptured ship, not a captured ship. And Washington's orders that were given to the Hannah before it sailed specifically stated that recaptured ships would not be counted as prizes for the crew to collect prize money for. So, but the ship owner would be expected to pay an unspecified reward to the crew for the recaptured ship, but it would not be worth the value of the ship. And catching a prize is much more valuable than catching a reprise or a recapture. And this angered the crew. This did not satisfy the crew, and they actually held a mutiny in port. And it was a bloodless mutiny, and it seemed to be more like a labor strike than what we normally think about when we say mutiny. And Washington sent men to arrest the mutineers, and because it was all in port, and they surrendered without incident. There was no fight. The army came and said, "You guys got to come with us. We're going to go have a court-martial." And they were brought to Cambridge for the court-martial, and they were all sentenced. Most of them got 30, 40 lashes, with the whip. And some of them, the ringleaders, got the 40 lashes, and they were discharged from the army. And some of the other guys got 20 lashes, and they were, allowed to continue serving. But now here comes the tricky part, the complicated part. The Unity was actually owned by a member of Congress. The congressman owned the Unity. And Washington had not yet told Congress that he hired ships and sent them out to sea to capture British supply vessels. So pretty much the cat's getting out of the bag here, and Congress is finding out what George Washington's up to, and George, he wasn't sure he had the actual authority to do this, so he didn't really know how to approach this, and he really didn't say anything to him. But of course the congressman found out about it, and the cat got out of the bag. On September 26, 1775, a strong gale was blowing. It was a bad storm. A British ship was heading for Boston carrying provisions from New Providence in the Bahamas. It was blown off course. It pulled into Marblehead for shelter from the storm. And in Marblehead, it expected that there'd be a British man-of-war there to protect it from the rebels. But there wasn't a British man-of-war there, so the ship turned around and headed back out to sea. But the gale was so strong that it went back into Marblehead anyways, and it anchored out from the dock. But this ship was actually it was called the Industry, and when the Industry was at anchor, it was boarded and captured by the local citizens. and it became a prize. And the next day, during the same storm, a ship called the Dolphin was carrying 65 sheep and 45 oxen, and it was common in those days during rough seas that would cause those animals, the cargo animals, to break their legs. And when the animal broke their legs, they had to be destroyed and thrown overboard into the sea. Now, not wanting to lose all of his valuable cargo, the captain found a lee side of an island and dropped his anchor near Gloucester, Massachusetts. And the Dolphin too was captured by the local patriots. And from that one storm, we've captured 2 British ships, and both ships were turned over to the Continental Army to become part of George Washington's Navy. But this all happened, like I said, September 26th, September 27th, and George Washington, when this happened, was right in the middle of the court-martials for the Hannah's crew, and he's not really sure he wanted to have 2 more ships in his Navy with all that going on. Now we'll go ahead and we'll talk about what Congress did to get a Navy going, and I got John Adams up on the slide because John Adams, he was the head of the Navy Committee for the Continental Congress, and all these activities were pretty much pushed forward by him. But in August 1775, the Rhode Island legislature voted to require their congressional delegation to propose the formation of a united colonies to build a navy. And on October 3rd, 1775, the Continental Congress received information about 2 unarmed British brigs were going to depart from England real soon and bound for Quebec, which were carrying lots of gunpowder, lots of cannons, lots of rifles or muskets for the British. They had all kinds of war supplies for the British troops. And there were 2 vessels that were coming over unarmed and unescorted. And we found out about this weeks and weeks ahead of time. And the Continental Army was desperate for guns and powder and other military supplies. It was also on October 3rd that the Rhode Island congressmen proposed the creation and they actually did what they were told to do in August. They actually proposed that the colonies build a continental navy. And 2 days later, on October 5th, George Washington wrote a letter to Congress telling Congress that he had commissioned 3 ships that he sent out to raid the British supply ships. And then it was on October 13th, 1775, that they actually received a letter from George Washington telling them about that they had a navy. And it was also on October 13th that Congress did get together and voted to build a navy, and that date is celebrated as the official birth date of the United States Navy, October 13th, 1775. Now, by the end of October 1775, there were 6 ships in George Washington's Navy. And by the time the Continental Navy got organized and went to sea, the George Washington's Navy had taken 38 prizes. That's 38 shiploads of supplies that the British Army never received, and 38 shiploads of supplies that we could use to support the Continental Army with. Now, in early March 1776, George Washington received some cannons that were taken from Fort Ticonderoga by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold the previous summer. And they were putting these cannons in place up on Dorshower Heights, which overlooks the south side of the city of Boston. And General Gates was really stuck in a bad position now. Okay, he was stuck in Boston. He did not have enough men or supplies to move out of the city, and if he did, he would have nowhere to go. He was stuck in the city. The food was bad. There was no firewood. Disease and malnutrition were running rampant. The morale and discipline of his army were very low. Now he saw cannons being installed on the hills overlooking the city, and he knew that very soon those cannonballs would be raining down on him and his supply ships. So what would you do? General Gates put all his men on the ships and left town. They left, and all George Washington and the Continental Army could do was to sit there and watch them go. They were powerless to fire anything at the British ships as they pulled out. The British had to leave their stronghold in Boston and retreat up to Canada. After 11 months of war, the colonists began to celebrate something. But as we shall see in the future lessons, the celebrations will be very, very short-lived. My name is John Sorensen, and thank you for listening to AmericanNavalHistory.com.